Aloha. It is my honor and pleasure to participate in this panel in the larger Americans and the Holocaust traveling exhibition. Mahalo nui to Alfie Garcia, Karina Chernisky, and Masahide Kato for inviting me to participate in this event. As a Jew, as an historian, and as someone who earned his PhD in modern German history, I can state without embellishment that the story of the Shoah, the Holocaust, the brutal attempt of the Nazi German regime to exterminate the Jewish people from the face of the earth was a driving force in shaping my career path and indeed my entire life. In the name of what Jews refer to as tikkun olam, or repairing the world, I humbly offer up the following reflections. Most of you will be familiar with the euphemistically entitled Kristallnacht, the pogrom of November 9th to 10th, 1938, a night when the Nazi regime suddenly unleashed a wave of violence against Jewish Germans. In that single night, hundreds of Jewish-owned businesses were destroyed, and hundreds of Jewish synagogues across the country were heartlessly set ablaze and burnt to the ground. Many local residents, motivated either by a greedy desire for loot or a nasty thirst for destruction, broke into private homes, beating and robbing their Jewish neighbors and raping Jewish women. Close to 100 people died in this night of brutality, and by morning, 26,000 German citizens of the Jewish faith had been rounded up and arrested before being shipped off to concentration camps where a dire fate awaited them. Buchenwald, Sachsenhausen, Dachau. Their crime? Simply being Jewish. When the dust had settled, Nazi authorities noted that while the general public expressed concern at the outbreak of mob violence and the mess that remained on the city streets, there was no mass outcry against the overt persecution of the country's Jews. Sadly, the moment to speak out against the Nazi state-sponsored discrimination had seemingly passed. In the 5.5 years since the Nazi seizure of power, a carefully crafted blend of propaganda, censorship, and intimidation had produced a silent majority that was either too fearful or too complacent to speak out in defense of a persecuted minority. Finally, in a perverse twist that only the Nazis could dream up, the regime required the Jewish victims to pay for the damages of Kristallnacht, even confiscating the payouts on insurance claims. Meanwhile, the vandals, robbers, rapists, and murderers went completely unpunished. This horrific action sent a clear message to all Germans that the rules of the game had changed, literally overnight. Nazi measures against Jewish Germans would now be violent, uncompromising, and conducted in full view of the public. Although the Nazis cited the assassination of the German diplomat Ernst von Rapp in Paris as a justification for this supposed reprisal action, the historian in us knows better. For long before the tragedy of Kristallnacht, the date of November 9th carried significant weight in the Nazi movement. It marked 15 years to the day that Adolf Hitler and the early followers of his National Socialist movement infamously launched an armed assault on a Munich beer hall before marching towards the Bavarian Defense Ministry in an ill-fated attempt to provoke a national revolution. And it marked 20 years to the day that a group of democratic reformers proclaimed Germany's first republic, prompting the abdication of the Kaiser, a rapid end to the First World War, and the adoption of a constitution that guaranteed fundamental human rights to Germany's citizens, regardless of race, class, gender, or religious beliefs. My, had the condition of Jewish Germans changed in the 20 years since. In her book, War and Genocide, acclaimed historian Doris Burgett tells the story of an older Jewish lawyer who was dining alone in a restaurant in his small hometown in February 1933, just weeks after Hitler was named chancellor. A group of Nazi thugs arrived at the scene, grabbed a nearby table, and began drinking beer and getting rather boisterous. Suddenly, one of the young Nazis called the waiter over and asked him to deliver a handwritten note to the older patron. Perhaps scared of refusing the request of his rowdy guests, the waiter walked across the room and nervously delivered the note to the other customer. As the gentleman read it, he trembled with a combination of rage and shame, for the message said, "Get out, you Jewish swine." He stood up, glared across the room at the Nazi thugs and announced, "I am a veteran of the World War. I risked my life for this country." The restaurant suddenly became deadly still and uncomfortably silent until the Nazi enthusiasts eventually resumed their taunts of the Jewish patron. The silence emboldened them. The failure of the other customers or employees to come to the defense of their target encouraged them to continue their verbal assaults. Sadly, the Jewish patron paid his bill and left. The waiter knew the gentleman well. It was a small town and he was a regular customer. When the waiter finished his shift, he paid a call at the man's house to express his regret and to return the overly generous tip that he had received. But by the time he had arrived, the war veteran had already packed up his bags and had his coat and hat in hand. Calmly, he explained that he was leaving his home country post haste. With the Nazis in power, there was no longer any future for him in Germany. In the decades of the 20th century, in the early decades of the 20th century, Jewish Germans were well integrated into the social fabric of the nation. They embraced their German national identity and heritage. They read German fairy tales to their children and took pride in their country's reputation as a champion of tolerance, humanism, and reason. They demonstrated their love of the fatherland symbolically by flying the German imperial flag in front of their homes and placing candles on their windowsills on the Kaiser's birthday. And in 1914, when the continent became engulfed in the most devastating war the world had ever seen, they demonstrated their patriotism with their lives. Altogether, 12,000 Jewish Germans died in battle in the Great War, and 35,000 more were decorated for bravery, even though Jews accounted for less than 1% of the country's population at the time. In the decade that followed the war, Jewish Germans made rapid advancement in the prestigious career fields of medicine, dentistry, publishing, law, and higher education. When the Nazis came to power, they immediately went to work, not only to roll back this progress, but also to segregate Jews from the rest of society and strip them from their rights as German citizens. One piece of discriminatory legislation followed the next. The Civil Service Law of April 1933 removed all Jews from government posts. Then followed a law to remove Jews from the medical profession, a law to remove Jews from the legal profession, a law to remove Jews from the education profession, a law to establish quotas of Jewish students in schools, and then Jews were later expelled from the school system completely. Even a law to prevent Jews from employing Aryan women less than 40 years of age in their homes. Park benches were labeled only for Aryans, and public beaches were adorned with signs proclaiming "free of Jews." In the first 18 months of Nazi rule, the primary check on Adolf Hitler's power came from the man who had named Hitler chancellor in the first place, President Paul von Hindenburg, the retired army general who had served as Germany's chief of staff during the war. There was no love lost between these two men. In fact, Hindenburg used to dismissively refer to Hitler as, quote, "a little Austrian corporal," end quote. And he had defeated Hitler in a contentious presidential runoff election in 1932. While Hindenburg was hardly an impassioned defender of Germany's Jews, as president, he refused to sign off on the Nazis' anti-Semitic legislation unless it contained one specific clause: Jewish war veterans and the children of war veterans were to be exempt from any discriminatory measures. As long as Hindenburg was alive, Hitler had no choice but to comply. For this reason, many Jewish war veterans in Germany assured their spouses and children not to be alarmed, that the Nazis' policies only applied to the others, not to them. Their position in German society was safe and secure. However, when President Hindenburg passed away in August 1934, the situation changed in an instant. Instead of holding presidential elections, Hitler proclaimed that the positions of president and chancellor would be combined into a single office, Führer of the Fatherland. Naturally, Hitler would assume that role. The Nazis enacted an armed services law that removed all German Jews from their positions in the military and declared them ineligible for military service. Hitler became supreme commander of the German armed forces, and all of those who remained in service were required to take a personal oath of unconditional obedience to Adolf Hitler, not to their country, not to their constitution, which the Nazis had already trampled all over, not to an elected office, but to a single man, Adolf Hitler. As you might be aware, the Nuremberg laws of 1935 prohibited marriage and sexual intercourse between Jews and so-called Aryan Germans. And the Nuremberg laws defined Jews racially instead of according to one's religious beliefs or practices, and explicitly stripped Jews of their German citizenship. But did you know that the Nuremberg laws even barred Jewish Germans from displaying their country's flag, an offense to be punished by hard labor? As the expression goes, the rest is history. In the subsequent months and years of Nazi rule, Jews were forbidden to serve as engineers at construction sites, to deal in currency, to serve as notaries, and eventually they were prohibited even from attending concerts or movies, owning a radio, or holding a driver's license. By the time of the Kristallnacht pogrom, Germany's Jews were no longer able to defend their rights. And after years of discriminatory propaganda, segregation, and intimidation, few non-Jewish Germans were willing to stand up to their Nazi leaders in the name of social justice. The Nazis carried out a two-pronged program of Säuberung, or cleansing, on both the cultural and racial fronts. On the cultural front, they classified certain elements of literature, art, and music as degenerate and purged them from society. They took the same approach to the country's human population. We are undoubtedly all familiar with the Nazis' quest for racial purity, but we should be mindful that purity only exists in a dynamic and interdependent relationship with impurity or contamination. While President Hindenburg displayed what we might call a more traditional form of anti-Semitism that provided space for exceptions, Nazi racial ideology constituted a fundamental shift in perspective. The Nazis stood at the tip of a more widespread and transnational eugenics movement, whose numerous advocates argued that a society could and should be genetically engineered to produce a healthier race, accomplished by encouraging the racially valuable to reproduce and preventing those deemed racially valueless from reproducing. Adolf Hitler distinguished between the emotional anti-Semitism, that's his exact quote, emotional anti-Semitism of the past, and what he viewed as a need to completely excise Jews and others from the national body, what we can describe as biological racism. The Nazis regularly deployed the metaphors of germ and parasite, claiming that Jews preyed on or infected the host nation of pure Aryan Germans. The only viable solution was therefore annihilation or extermination. When I taught my Nazi Germany history class, I relied upon the following image to convey this point. If you were thirsty and I offered you a glass of pure mountain spring water, you would accept it eagerly and gratefully. But what if I put a spoonful of gasoline in the water? What if it were a single drop of gasoline? Would you still drink it? Probably not. You'd probably view the water as contaminated and dangerous. That is precisely how the Nazis viewed the Jewish presence in and influence on German society, but also the presence of other stigmatized populations, four of which I will discuss now. 1, Afro-Germans. A few hundred mixed-race children were born in 1919 through relationships between French African soldiers and German women during the occupation of the Rhineland after the First World War. Teenagers, by the time Hitler came to power, the Nazis referred to them as the, quote, Rhineland bastards, end quote, and the Black Curse. It was not enough for the Nazis to remove them from their jobs and homes. In 1937, the Gestapo formed a secret commission to track every last one of them down and subject them to forced sterilization. Group number 2, so-called gypsies. The Sinti and Roma are different branches of the Romani people, a culture traced back to northern India, whose people migrated across Europe during the Middle Ages. There were about 20,000 Sinti and Roma living in Germany in 1933, and the Nazis viewed them as foreign, bastardized, inferior, rootless, untrustworthy, and parasitic, the same stereotypes they ascribed to the Jews. Hitler did not show much interest in the so-called gypsies and never once mentioned them in public. However, the Nazis created an office called the Reich Center for Combating the Gypsy Nuisance in 1937 and conducted a full racial assessment of Germany's gypsy population. The director of the Nazis' Research Unit for Racial Hygiene and Population Science Biology soon recommended compulsory sterilization for Sinti and Roma. Quote, just as the state has already begun to successfully treat retarded people, end quote. After considering a number of measures over the next several years, Nazi leaders eventually stripped Sinti and Roma of German citizenship and shipped them off to death camps such as Auschwitz-Birkenau. Group number 3, homosexuals. The Nazis rejected the notion that one's sexuality was a private matter. Heinrich Himmler, commander of the SS, claimed that, quote, all things which take place in the sexual sphere are not the private affair of the individual, but signify the life and death of the nation, end quote. The Nazis believed that homosexual Aryans were shirking their public duty to procreate. They were also viewed as an infection that needed to be removed from the national body. In a 1937 speech to SS leaders, Himmler remarked, quote, everything which touches upon sexual matters ceases to be private when the life or death of a nation depends on it. It is the difference between world domination or annihilation. A pure race with few children already has one foot in the grave. It is essential to realize that if we allow this infection to continue in Germany without being able to fight it, it will be the end of Germany. These creatures must be exterminated, end quote. Group 4, the last one. Others deemed unfit. The Nazis supported programs that called for the forced sterilization of those suffering from a range of conditions, including schizophrenia, manic depression, epilepsy, and alcoholism. Those who were hearing or visually impaired, and those classified as feeble-minded. This was legalized through the 1933 Law for the Prevention of Progeny with Hereditary Diseases. In fact, the Nazis' first ventures into mass killings through gassing were carried out as part of their Aktion T4, Operation T4, in 1938 and 1939 against tens of thousands of hospital patients who had been labeled as hereditarily or congenitally ill, even children and babies. The Nazis referred to these people as lebensunwürdiges Leben, life unworthy of life. And while the Nazis took eugenics to its most heinous and perverted extreme, the movement was prevalent in many other countries in the 1920s and 30s, including the United States, in fact, especially the United States. Many of you will recognize this famous quotation from Lutheran minister Martin Niemöller in response to what he witnessed as a citizen of the Third Reich. First, they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. Let us remember, silence emboldens the malefactor. Remaining silent in the face of racism and injustice is itself a transgression. Thinking back to the story I offered a moment ago, what if one sympathetic and courageous customer in that restaurant in 1933 had told those Nazi bullies to settle down, to salute that German war veteran, instead of disparaging him? What if 1,000 sympathetic and courageous Germans in 1,000 restaurants, cafes, beer gardens, train stations, public parks, and beaches across the country had spoken out against Nazi abuse, against the party's ruthless policies of discrimination and intolerance in 1933, when Hitler first came to power? What if the majority, whose silence emboldened Nazi thugs, had spoken out in support of their Jewish neighbors when the Nazis tried to gradually strip them of their civil liberties, to revoke their citizenship? What if that silent majority had also spoken out against the Nazis' persecution of socialists, Jehovah's Witnesses, Afro-Germans, Sinti and Roma, homosexuals, and people with disabilities? What might happen if we speak out today in support of those facing discrimination, persecution, and social injustice? And what will happen if we remain silent? In the name of human dignity and Tikkun Olam, thank you and aloha.
So without further ado, Dr. Kato, I'll hand it off to you.
Okay. Aloha ahihahi. My name is Masahide Kato, and this evening I want to talk about the enduring legacy of exterminationism. I'm still in shock with the all these historical accounts of Nazism, so I'm trying to recover from that. But first of all, I want to acknowledge my heartfelt gratitude, kamahalo nui, to Alfie Garcia and Karina Janeski for facilitating this exhibit and event. Also to Amy Hayashi, who invited me to this group at the planning stage of this event. And most importantly, Alan Rosenfeld, who joined in at the last minute at our request. So mahalo nui to Alan. I want to start off with my intellectual genealogy to Hannah Arendt. My mentor in the doctoral program at UH Manoa was Manfred Henningsen, who is originally from Germany and was mentored by Erich Vogelin, a world-renowned political philosopher, contemporary of Hannah Arendt and Fyodor Adorno. Henningsen was also my colleague Louis Herman's mentor. We are separated by about 5 to 7 years. Vogelin and Arendt knew each other's works in Germany before both escaped from Nazi Germany. But their friendship began in 1951 when Vogelin reviewed Arendt's The Origin of Totalitarianism, and they started their correspondence. Henningsen would talk to us students about his first nervous encounter with Hannah Arendt when he was in her seminar, asking her a question. Henningsen carried on Arendt's legacy in his dedication to the comparative studies of genocidal regimes, besides his expertise in political philosophy. The natural and organic influence of Vogelin and Arendt on my philosophical and pedagogical perspectives emerged after my PhD through my continued association with Henningsen, along with his other former students. Hannah Arendt and Plato are the only two philosophers that appear in 2 sections of my course in political philosophy. The initial inspiration for this talk, in hindsight, came from Henningsen's draft paper he shared with us last year, in which he traverses the contemporary landscape of the state violence and the responses of civil society, from police brutality protests in the US, the people's resistance to the PRC's COVID restrictions, Hong Kong uprising, and also into the history of the fall of Berlin, Tiananmen Square, and the Velvet Revolution, entitled, quote, "The Enchantments and Disenchantments of Civil Society," unquote. Now, I want to get into the brief bio of Hannah Arendt. She was born in Hanover in 1906. Her father was an engineer, and her mother was an ardent supporter of Social Democrats. She studied philosophy under Karl Jasper. She earned her PhD at the age of 22 with her dissertation entitled, quote, "The Concept of Love in St. Augustine," unquote. While deeply rooted in the classics and German philosophy, Arendt spent 20-some years studying the Jewish experience in the modern age, starting with the biography of Rahel Varnhagen, the early 19th century Jewish socialite. With the rise of Hitler and being interrogated by Gestapo, Arendt decided to migrate to France in 1933, but remained as an active Zionist. As she was interned in France in 1940 due to her German national status, she migrated to US and became a US citizen in 1950. She was the first woman to be appointed to full professorship at Princeton. She also taught at the University of Chicago and the New School for Social Research. With a path-breaking publication of The Origin of Totalitarianism, Arendt has turned her attention to the critique of modern society in general, extending the lessons of Nazism and Holocaust to the contradiction of modernity. Now I'm going to analyze the enduring legacy of exterminationism by using a set of 3 concepts by Hannah Arendt: the banality of evil, executioner versus victim, and loneliness. The first concept, banality of evil. One of the well-known concepts of Arendt that pertains to Nazism is the banality of evil. What she saw in Nazism and the way the Holocaust was carried out was not an act of evil in a dialectic relationship or in binary opposition to good, as, quote, "It possesses neither depth nor demonic dimension. It can overgrow and lay waste the whole world precisely because it spreads like a fungus on the surface," unquote. She also explains it in the context of the limitation of legal justice. Quote, "It is senseless to hang a man for murder who took part in the fabrication of corpses. There were crimes which no punishment seems to fit because all punishment is limited by the death penalty. The unprecedented is neither the murder itself, nor the number of the victims, nor even the number of persons who united to perpetrate them. It is much rather the ideological nonsense which caused them, the mechanization of a world of the dying in which nothing any longer made sense," unquote. Arendt also called the banality of evil as, quote, "administrative genocide," unquote, where the horrendous crime of genocide takes place as a procedural matter. The Nanjing massacre and other lesser known massacres perpetrated by the Japanese military demonstrated the banality of administrative genocide quite anticlimactically. One of the episodes of Japanese atrocities leading up to the Nanjing massacre was, quote, "the contest to cut down 100 with their swords," unquote, between the two second lieutenants of the Shanghai Expeditionary Force. The samurai headhunting competition was reported in the newspaper in a matter of sports reporting. Contrary to the sensational heading, it was nothing but a banal process of counting the beheadings of the captives as a form of random execution. As one of the officers testified after the war, the beheading of prisoners was nothing more than, quote, "an everyday occurrence," unquote, among officers at that time. The banality of evil as an extermination procedure continued in the post-war era, such as Cultural Revolution, Indonesia's anti-communist purge, Pol Pot, Rwanda, to the recent Myanmar military regime genocide of Rohingya. These instances can be categorized as macro exterminationism. What is a much more banal form of exterminationism in a contemporary time can be called molecular exterminationism that takes place in dispersed sites, undertaken not necessarily by the major state actors such as the military, but the agents of the state and quasi or non-state actors, where the boundary between the state and civil society becomes very blurry. It is molecular in the sense that there is high concentration of the banality of evil in the action or process, like how toxins and poisons get concentrated as they go through the food chain. But these two aren't necessarily mutually exclusive. Arendt talks about how totalitarianism transforms class into mass movement, how mass movement organizes as an organ of terror. She gives an example of the multiplication of paramilitary organizations such as SA, Assault Division, SS, Protective Squadron, which then extended to a whole host of organizations such as Nazi Socialist Students Organizations, Nazi Women's Organization, Nazi organizations for university professors, lawyers, physicians. We saw the similar multiplication of terror organs in the Red Guard in Cultural Revolution and anti-communist vigilante groups in the Indonesian massacre, where the difference between the state and non-state actors became indistinguishable. Now, in contemporary context, we can see more instances of molecular exterminationism embedded in civil society. Perhaps the most emblematic one is the execution of George Floyd by Minnesota police officer Derek Chauvin, in which Chauvin knelt on Floyd's neck, who was facing down and immobilized by the handcuffs for 9 minutes till Floyd's last breath. In response to Floyd's repeated plea, I can't breathe, Chauvin told Floyd to relax. The whole process of execution was characteristically procedural. Banality of evil shown to the world through internet enraged the public, which in turn led to the largest US protest in history, whose effect rippled through Europe, Asia, and Africa. The second concept, executioner and victim. Quote, the inhabitants of totalitarian society, Arendt argues, can only be executioners or victims, unquote. We could see this dichotomy of victim and executioner being materialized in police brutality and citizens' defense. In the case of Trayvon Martin and George Zimmerman, Zimmerman's defense in court was essentially if he didn't take the position of executioner, he would have been the victim. This same line of defense was repeated during the trial of the murder of Colin Elders by the State Department secret agent Christopher Dede that took place in the early morning brawl at the McDonald's in Waikiki. Both of these cases and other numerous cases, such as Casey Goodson, who was fatally shot by a sheriff in Columbus, Ohio, for entering his own house in December 2020, the determination of the victim is largely based on the profiling. The basis of profiling is arbitrary as random selection based on the likeness. It is similar to the selection process of executioners or SS troops in Nazi Germany. Himmler selected candidates from photographs according to purely racial criteria. In the case of Nazism and communist totalitarianism, according to Arendt, the determination of the status of executioner and victim is derived from the pure logicality of ideology, namely the law of nature and the law of history, which has no contact with the actual reality. But in a contemporary society, we no longer have such grandiose teleological ideology as the law of nature and the law of history. Instead, we have much more banal form of pure logicality that manifests as Michel Foucault's notion of disciplinary normalization, through which the arbitrary definition of normative social behavior is defined with punitive sanctions. Audre Lorde defines this process of normalization in America as, quote, mythical norm, unquote, that resides in the edge of consciousness. This type of norm has a much more direct link with the institutional practice of profiling than social behavior. Quote, this norm is usually defined as white, thin, male, young, heterosexual, Christian, and financially secure, unquote. The victims are thus selected or manufactured based on this mythic norm. Anybody who falls outside of this mythic norm can be potentially subjected to the status of victim. The third concept, isolation and loneliness. Arendt talks about isolation and impotence, or the state of loneliness, as the effect of totalitarian domination. The difference between solitude and loneliness, Arendt argues, is that while both require being alone, the latter takes place in, quote, the company with others, unquote. In other words, loneliness is the state of total alienation in the midst of masses. By being alone, solitude allows one to reconnect with self, others, and the world. By contrast, loneliness makes one lose trust in oneself as the, quote, the partner of his thoughts, unquote, and the elementary confidence in others and the world. Quote, what prepares men for totalitarian domination in a non-totalitarian world is the fact that loneliness has become an everyday experience of the ever-growing masses of our society, unquote. Perusing the recent research on the mass and school shootings, one encounters complex multi-factors that contribute to the motives of the shooters, such as mental health, the experience of being bullied, being a loner, feeling of disempowerment, quest for fame, cohesion of intolerant, homogeneous, and tight-knit community. What stands out from these potential factors in the context of our discussion is the interface between loneliness, disempowerment, and the quest for fame. Having lost trust in oneself, other, and the world, the quest for meaning among shooters is not only to take the position of an executioner to escape from the victimhood, but also empower themselves in the quest for fame, to exceed the body count made by their predecessors, such as the Columbine shooting in 1999. The quest for fame and maximum body count in turn translates itself in the shooter's prolonged operation. One study finds, quote, at least 44% of high fatality attacks were planned for a year or more, unquote. In this preparation period, the shooters engaged in research on the, quote, victim-rich target locations, unquote, and on the prevention of the victim's escape in order to increase their lethality. The renewed quest for meaning among the executioners became the quest for a perfect death camp. Another study on the averted threats of rampage school violence reveals the kill list the perpetrators prepared included the categories as goth, punks, commies, hippies, preps, gays, ghetto Uyghurs, and Muslims. One can say the purification policy has permeated into the molecular structure among the mass shooters. As we can see, there has to be more than police reform and gun control to tackle multiple facets of molecular exterminationism. Now, what is the way out of this molecular totalitarianism? Arendt's answer is the beginning. Arendt here resonates with Jean-Jacques Rousseau's axiom, every man is born free, but everywhere he is in chain. Quote, but there remains also the truth that every end in history necessarily contains a new beginning. Beginning before it becomes a historical event is the supreme capacity of man. Politically, it is identical with man's freedom. That a beginning be made, man was created, said Augustine. This beginning is guaranteed by each new birth. It is indeed every man, unquote. In other words, the beginning or the capacity to begin is the foundation of freedom. I see this new beginning and the way out of molecular totalitarianism and extreme exterminationism, first in the identity and consciousness of a survivor, as the subjectification of the victims that transcends the binary of executioners versus victims. The most remarkable instance of survivors' consciousness I have encountered is Okinawan survivors of the Battle of Okinawa, a war with genocide in which both Americans and Japanese committed atrocities against against the Okinawans that resulted in the extermination of a quarter of Okinawan population. They identified themselves as, quote, Kampo no Kuenuksa, unquote, which literally means the leftover food of the artillery bombing. They see war not as an act of humans, but of monster. They attribute their survival to the fact that monster called war shunned from eating them. This transhuman consciousness, I believe, led to the establishment of Cornerstone of Peace in 1995, where the names of over 240,000 who died in the Battle of Okinawa, regardless of their civilian or soldier status, their national origins, and ethnicities are all honored, eliminating the binary between executioners and victim. Needless to say, the Okinawan survivors' consciousness is at the core of their persistent struggle for demilitarization. Now back to mass shooting. In the aftermath of Stone Douglas High School shooting, the student survivors organized a new movement called Never Again that turned into March for Lives, a nationwide school walkout. This movement inspired Greta Thunberg to start her alone sign-holding action outside the Swedish parliament called School Strike for Climate, which rapidly evolved into global climate action network among the Gen Z youth. Perhaps the new beginning Arendt talks about could also be the Gen Z generation. The Gen Z generation, as I have observed my own daughter and her network of friends on a daily basis, is naturally oriented towards what Victor Turner calls liminality, in-between realm that occurs in the rite of passage. The realm of liminality is characterized by ambivalence, non-binarism, mixing of categories, and general transvariation, as we can see, for example, in the prevalence of the non-binary gender orientation, their communication through memes, and their style of activism, shown, for instance, in their sabotage of Trump rally in Tulsa by grossly inflating the registration. But unlike the liminality, the Gen Z generation's embrace of ambivalence and transvariation is not a temporary state, but is a part of their everyday life. This everyday form of liminality brings it closer to Mikhail Bakhtin's notion of carnivalesque that has an immense revolutionary and transformative potential as it defies the logicality of any type of ideology. The Gen Z consciousness can thus be the beginning of a molecular revolution that Emma Goldman would have loved to dance to. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Kato. So now seems like a good time to open up questions. I've collected a few.
Oh,
And-
Alfie, actually, so Dr. Kato, with your screen, what were you trying to show people? Because
Oh,
it
you didn't
was
show
just a segment of your screen.
oh, I'm sorry. So that was just my sort of itinerary, the item.
Oh, okay.
Oh, just
I did-
the text?
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you for clarifying that.
Yeah. Sorry about that.
Okay. So I can wait a second or two, but feel free to just drop them into chat. We had some questions that were available for registrants. If you had a question, so I'll read off of those. To Alan, to what degree did the USA and allies know and document the evolving genocidal policies of Nazism from World War I to World War II?
Well, the Nazis weren't in power in World War I, so we'd have to focus on World War II. And I would say, first of all, if you're curious in that topic or about that topic, please come out to the Americans in the Holocaust exhibit, because they do a really great job of looking at what Americans knew and when. Because there were Jewish refugees streaming out of Germany and across the world, although many countries very much hesitated to accept them, there was a great deal known about the Jewish extermination. But I think that the scale and the brutality of what took place in the death camps was beyond human imagination, capacity to imagine, because nothing like that had been, I mean, there was the Armenian genocide, of course, too, but it was just so extreme that it was sort of beyond the limits of what folks could imagine. And so the reactions of, General Patton and others who were, present for the liberation of the camps was one of just complete astonishment, even though they certainly knew of the, the Nazi legal and political, enactments that I talked about, stripping Jews gradually of their citizenship, and all those hateful policies were known across the world. But even though they knew of different kinds of camps, the details of the extermination camps and the what daily life was like there, the condition of the prisoners and how malnourished they were upon their moment of liberation, those images were just too stark, I would argue, for people to even imagine until they saw them firsthand.
Thank you, Dr. Rosenfeld. So now we did have Andrew who wanted to pose a question to you. Andrew, can you unmute yourself?
Yes, thank you. So first of all, I'd like to say both of you gave really interesting presentations, and thank you. So briefly for Dr. Kato, I just wanted to say I'm not a political philosopher by any means, and I remember I struggled trying to read Hannah Arendt myself, and I was trying to find some of the answers, but I think it's really appropriate to do this at a library event, because I don't know how many people here know, but she worked in the period right after the war with a group called the Jewish Cultural Reconstruction, which tried to return the books and Sefer Torah that were from the victims who had been exterminated. Their artifacts had been taken. So this agency was set up, and actually, so many of the libraries in the diaspora received some of their work. So I was just going to say that that's I think a nice kind of connection to your theme. Then I wanted to ask a question for Dr. Rosenfeld. So I appreciated hearing your talk. I know as historians, we hate the idea of kind of trying to make the contemporary and being able to analyze it. But I think, thinking about Weimar and the rise of, the essay and these things, that I was feeling a lot of like PTSD, sort of like, even though I was obviously not around then, but at the end of the Trump administration, when the January 6th putsch, and I was just trying to, again, the idea of what a citizen can do and how it's certainly nothing like the Holocaust, but the idea of how fragile, before that time, one always wondered, how did Nazism emerge out of Weimar democracy, this kind of idea of civilization. But, I never would have imagined how perilously close it seemed to the end of democracy and cultural institutions and civil society that we saw not that long ago. Feel free to dodge the question. And as historians, that's something we usually, want to throw a far distance because it is too close to analyze, I know, but I'll just leave it there. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I can just give a thank you so much for the question, and thanks for the observations and comments. And of course, I'm no soothsayer. I can't predict the future, but one has to look at the January 6th insurrection you mentioned, and was that a vision of something more? I mean, people might have laughed and dismissed at the beer hall putsch. 10 years later, Adolf Hitler was in power. And so there are certainly comparisons we can draw. What I would argue in the case of, Nazi Germany, having, looked at it closely, the rise of the Nazis as a graduate student doing research on it, is that certainly the drastic conditions with the onset of the Great Depression, or the World Economic Crisis, as they would say in Germany, and the mass unemployment created this very unstable environment, which I would argue without which I don't believe the Nazis ever would have been able to come to power. But then you saw, like, for example, in the pandemic, and we had these very high rates of unemployment and these very angry people, and things began to get very unstable. And you got the sense that, especially on watching things unfold on January 6th, that, oh my goodness, in what direction could this unfold, right? And I think that produced anxiety. I have too suffered from PTSD as a student of history, and knowing what happened to a thriving democracy, a thriving republic in Weimar Germany in 1933.
Okay, thank you. This question is for Dr. Kato. Where does the embrace of ambiguity lead? Certainly we need something more than ambiguity.
Yes. So the Gen Z part, the Gen Z consciousness, yeah, definitely. It's when Arendt analyzed the sort of victim versus executioner, and also the whole logicality of this ideology, and there's a certain rigidness of their thinking. And there's sort of a gap between what's happening in reality and then the constructed world with this pure logic of ideology. But there's a certain, I think, play around, for instance, their gender orientation, or like the one that I mentioned about this, the sabotaging the Tulsa rally. So it's not like, to bring in like the other question I was aware of, it's a really different orientation that we're seeing with ambiguity, transvaluation, the Gen Z generation. So when you look at Greta Thunberg or people like that, or the Parkland High School students, there's this new sense of activism that's emerging. And I think we can kind of tap into that as an older generation. And in fact, I was having this text conversation with my friends who went back to full-time activist after he retired from the teaching jobs. And I was having this conversation, we need to have a new ideas. We can't be having this old activism repeated in this new generation. So maybe it's time to like really learn from this new generation that's emerging. And as I mentioned, the carnivalesque, that's when those rigid value system is questioned, and there's a certain play and in a way like a joy in this, the carnivalesque, and I think that's what's missing in the old school movement and old school activism. So perhaps this interaction from the older generation like myself with my daughter's generation, redefining what activism is, what the movement is, there may be something, the new beginning can happen. And of course, that shouldn't be sufficient. We have to reconstruct a new type of community, rejuvenation of community where people won't feel alienated. But I don't think we can use the old notion of community imposed upon them, but we have to sort of have a new paradigm of what constitutes community. I think that's in that direction. I think Gen Z will be very important in guiding us towards the new paradigm. That's what I'm saying.
I wonder if I can ask a follow-up question to that. In regards to survivors' consciousness, is this part of a cyclical cycle that this Gen Z or more current generations have this, or is it cyclical? Like what's given rise to this survivors' consciousness among this generation?
That's a very interesting question. I wasn't paying attention to the survivors' consciousness and how that overlaps with the Gen Z consciousness. But what I meant with the survivors' consciousness is that that's the new beginning when people survive Holocaust, Battle of Okinawa, or in my case, Hiroshima bombing. When people survive those type of events, that's horrendous crime and horrendous tragedy and PTSD and all that, I think there's a certain sort of new awareness that's sort of transcendent. And that's what I saw in the Okinawans' cornerstone of peace, that they really transcended the execution of the victim. And then they see in a holistic manner, they don't even consider themselves as humans, but they are like the leftovers from the monsters. So in a way, they are transcending the whole human sentiments in a positive sense, because war dehumanizes all the humans, but they transcend in a very unusual way. And but that's a good point. I haven't really explored the connection between Gen Z consciousness, survivors' consciousness, and the Okinawans' consciousness. But that would be a very interesting topic to pursue for myself and others.
Thank you. I have one question again from Dr. Wertheimer. Did you want to speak to that? Oh, okay. Actually, I think it's from Joseph. What role, this is for Dr. Rosenfeld, what role did, if any, did anti-Semitism play in the U.S. disbelief of the Holocaust? Whether it's hesitancy to enter World War II, the failure to bomb train tracks or rescue victims?
Once again, I would encourage everyone to come out and tour the exhibit, Americans in the Holocaust, because it delves into this question quite explicitly and in detail. And I, as an historian of, I was trained as a historian of Germany, not a historian of the United States, so I paid less attention to what was going on in the United States at the time. But it's covered very well in the exhibit that the attitudes towards accepting Jewish refugees during the war, people were very hesitant, and the vast majority, even after the announcement of the genocide, really hesitated for the United States to take on refugees. And of course, the United States also had immigration policies in which there were quotas of immigrants allowed into the country based on the ethnic composition of the United States at that time, which restricted the number. And Jews living in Germany or other parts of different parts of occupied Europe were therefore counted in the same way as the Nazi perpetrators, so they were not actually under U.S. policy separated out as a special group. They were just counted as Germans, and there was a cap put on how many Germans could come into the country. I know also from having done research on it, and at the beginning in the introduction, they mentioned that I'd done this study of the hearings of German and Italian internees in Hawaii during World War II, civilian internees. And those include a few Jewish refugees from Nazi Germany. So for example, the Arizona War Memorial in Pearl Harbor was designed by an Austrian Jew named Alfred Price, who fled Nazi Germany or Austria, Nazi-occupied Austria in 1938 and 1939, wound up in Hawaii, and then was interned shortly after, in the days after Pearl Harbor, maybe the day after the attack on Pearl Harbor, and wound up in an internment camp with his wife on Sand Island, and talks about how he was forced to clean toilets with his bare hands in the concentration, in the internment camp on Sand Island. So, and that was not necessarily a result of Nazi discrimination. But what I would say was that in some regards, and this is captured during in the exhibit, is that there was a lack of empathy with the Jewish victims, a lack of understanding of the sort of nuances of the conflict. And you can can even make a connection to Dr. Cotto's talks of the banality of evil, people not being voted by hatred. I'm sure, and sometimes we know there was anti-Semitism in the United States at the time, but there was also a lot of indifference. And that's probably what I would say, just indifference, in that accepting refugees would be a nuisance and an inconvenience. And especially when there was high unemployment in the United States and the economic difficulties that still persisted throughout the decade of the 1930s.
Another question from Joseph. Early on in your discussion, you used terms like genocide, Holocaust, and Shoah. Would you be able to clarify those terms, I guess, for our viewers and their cultural relationships?
Sure. I mean, it's not my area of expertise, but in Israel, they would use the term Shoah to refer to the Holocaust, and Yom HaShoah would be the Holocaust Day of Remembrance. And then Holocaust now and then we can start to get political, right? So for I don't want to say for many Jews, for many people, Holocaust refers solely to the genocide of Jews, but others would take exception to that and say, no, there's also, the Armenian genocide, it could be considered a Holocaust as well. So the genocide, of course, would mean the murder of any ethnic group, right? So the Greek roots for killing, side, and then for geno, based on genetics or ethnicity, right? So we could look at an array of genocides in world history, several of which Dr. Cotto mentioned in his talk, including contemporary ones. In recent memory, the Rohingya, you have Southern Sudan, you have what's going on with the in China with the Uyghurs.
The Uyghurs.
Yeah, thank you, the Uyghurs. And so any kind of effort to exterminate a group based on their ethnic composition would be a genocide.
Thank you. Karina, am I missing any questions?
I think a few more. So for both Alan and Masaide, is it accurate or meaningful to compare socio-political movements and actors in 1920s to 1940s in Germany with current socio-political movements / actors in the USA?
Did you want to go first, Dr. Cotto, or should I go first, or?
Yeah, can you go first?
Okay. Thank you. So we had some time. This one came in prior to the talk via email. So I would say, clearly there are similarities that we can. So the exercise is useful, right? Because we need to, by comparing and contrasting, we can highlight the similarities and also the differences. The problem just becomes when we have false equivalencies, right? So we can see similarities in terms of the tendency to embrace and welcome authoritarian rule, the element of ethno-nationalism, the embrace or welcoming of violence as a legitimate political means, and the rejection of international rule or international order, whether it be the League of Nations in the 1930s or the WHO and the United Nations and whatever else today. But I would like to point out a big difference between fascism as it evolved in Italy and also in Germany in the 1920s and 30s and these Trumpist authoritarian movements today, right? And that is that the Nazis carried out massive deficit spending. So did the Trump administration, but that was through the reduction of taxes for different people. Massive deficit spending in order to expand the federal infrastructure to create new ministries, new government ministries. And there's, of course, Joseph Goebbels' Ministry for Enlightenment and Propaganda. They created a new ministry for aviation, Ministry for Armaments and War Production, Ministry for Church Affairs, Ministry for Science, Education, and Culture. So there was this vast expansion of the federal or the national government bureaucracy. And it seems to me that the folks who are embracing authoritarian rule in this country today are not advocating for a massive expansion of government bureaucracy, especially at the federal level, but rather want to see a reduction or even elimination of the scale of federal government power. And the Nazis had, they tried to take every aspect of society and capture it under the Nazi umbrella, down to youth groups, women's groups, church groups, what have you. And so that level of infiltration and surveillance, of course, of the population through the Gestapo, that to me is one important difference between the fascism of the prior century and what we're seeing today.
So for me, it's kind of repeating what I mentioned in the talk, but I think the tendency in the contemporary society in comparison to 1920s and 30s, not just the Germany, but if you look at the Japanese fascism or Italian fascism, is that it was essentially the core was a state-based violence and surveillance and so forth. But what we see today is it's sort of ubiquitous and it's dispersed. So when you look at the MAGA movement, it's not this coming from a party. It's like, it's not like Republican Party. Well, most of them support the MAGA movement, but it's really dispersed in the civil society where anybody can actually recreate the fascism, in their micro realm. So that's why I refer to police brutality and mass shooting, because that's really quite new compared to the 1920s and 30s. And no longer state orchestrating those movements, but people taking on their own sort of movement. So it partially has to do with the internet culture. So you have this MAGA movement spreading across the world. Now you see in Canada, this whole anti-vaccination movement happening, and people can pick up just one click away. You can turn into QAnon person or flat earthers, and state is not involved in any of those things. I think that's really alarming, but at the same time, we have to be cognizant of the difference. So therefore, when we organize the sort of counter movement or resistance to that fascism, we have to take a different approach. That's how I feel with the comparison.
Thank you both. So the person that posed that question just had a comment to what you guys were saying, which is that it feels like the current movement wants to kill big government. So while everybody ponders that, for both Alan and Masahide, another question came in for you, and I'll read it right now. I wonder how the Gen Z worldview and connectivity and ambiguity worked or didn't work with the actions of post Gen Z white youth Kyle Rittenhouse And I'm also thinking about Elliot Rodger, the young white male shooter who killed 6 people in Isla Vista, California.
Oh yeah, so yeah, definitely I'm aware of that. Like I seen this footage of this Gen Z generation women, right? They're actually it's a little different from pro-life. It's much more radical in their sort of a support for like Texas abortion bill. And definitely Kyle Rittenhouse is Gen Z generation. So definitely there's that reactionary trends among the Gen Z generation. There's no doubt. I mean, every generation have those, you know, the forces that putting together. But I think what I see is that as a generation that's father's generation, parents' generation to the Gen Z generation, I want to really cultivate the aspect of the liminality and carnivalesque. For example, as an instructor, I see Gen Z generation come into my classroom and I see them, they have a different sort of orientation. We can't use our old school lenses to judge them. So, okay, you're not writing well, so therefore you fail in writing. What other media are you good at? So for instance, in my classes, I started to balance writing with oral communication. So I started to adopt podcasts as a form of assignment. And they were like really excited about it because they can be themselves. They can find themselves through podcasts. And that creates a new mode of communication among themselves in the classroom setting. So we may have to nurture that part that's carnivalesque and liminality, ambivalence, and transvaluation. Otherwise, you're right. There are other movements, other direction that they're going. So it's not going to be just one unified Gen Z generation, but there's sort of like a, in a way, dialectic is going on in that generation as well.
Thank you for that. So another question came in response to your responses to that question, which is that we have skirted one of the major issues for both topics, and that is the relationship of capitalism to both speakers' subjects. Do either of you have a response or comments to that?
Yeah, sure. I'd love to take that one. So yes, you're absolutely correct. And one of the most intriguing sort of primary sources I came across, I want to say that the author's name was Knickerbocker, and he was an American journalist who went to Germany in the height of the Great Depression in 1931, 1932. And he did a number of fascinating things, including living with a working class communist family for a period of time and seeing how they struggled to even have put food on the table. And he also had a one-on-one interview with Adolf Hitler. The book was published in 1932. And it was called, I think it was called Germany, Fascist or Soviet. And the question he posed was that Germany was going to go one direction or another. And actually in the elections in the early 1930s, the only two parties that gained voters in Germany, had about 7 or 8 different competing parties, were the Nazi Party and the Communist Party was actually gaining, I think got as high as 16% in national elections. And so it was this teetering kind of thing, in which direction would it go? And Hitler said to him at the time, you know, and he's saying, what's the message for American investors and American readers back home? And he's, because we have all these ideologies, and what's really the difference here? And Hitler said, well, the difference is, if the Nazis take over, they will not nationalize industry and the banks, and the communists will. And guess who was the biggest investor at Germany in 1932? Americans were the largest foreign investor in Germany. So yeah, there's absolutely an important connection.
I want to ask the question. Hi, everybody. Thank you for the 2 conversations. I was really asking not so much about whether Lamont and others and Ford invested, but looking at the crisis of the 30s and looking at Professor Kato's interest in Iran. sneaking around this whenever we discuss modernity, alienation, juggling of political parties. We really can't avoid the question of capitalism. And both Arendt's understanding of capitalism and also what in fact was a state or fascist version of capitalism. So in the end, the Nazis are great capitalists. They don't shut down their industry. So I'd like you two to think about whether, in light of your interest in political violence and your interest in both state and civil society, excluding certain people, how does that fit or not fit into the question that certainly, if you read Polanyi and others during the time period, they had no doubt that capitalism was in crisis, and the crisis of capitalism is what produced what you guys have been talking about. It produced Arendt's interest, it produced the Nazis. So how would you address, say, Polanyi, who would be here and say, look, this is the great transformation. What you have here is the consequence of capitalism, and capitalism will work with precisely these kinds of exclusions and hierarchies. The banality of evil is an interesting proposition. I'd like to have a conversation with you because I think Arendt was actually taken in the trial. Eichmann was an ideologue. He was a Nazi ideologue from the get-go. And I think Arendt, in her German idealist position, sought a mechanistic view and completely misunderstood him, particularly as the alleged defendant. So I think we've got to be really careful. There's no banality without an ideology. And even banality is its own ideology, right? It's like liberals who say there are no ideologies. So I want to shut up. Andrew knows I can go on and on. I don't want to do that. So I just like, and there's no way at 8:18 you're going to answer the capitalism question, but if you could just think about that in light of your presentations, which were superb, my only question would be, where is capitalism in your discussions?
So yeah, very good question. Actually, when O.J. Lord talks about this mythic norm, being white, thin, and all that, it's actually, she's connecting that to capitalism, how the capitalism sort of differentiates the the humans into categories, and then this whole exploitation process needs this categorization, hierarchization. So this mythic norm functions as part of capitalism. That's actually the where she's coming. She's also socialist as well. So I think what's sort of behind, for instance, Foucault's notion of normalization, there's a sort of like a big picture that we are all embedded in, that if we use capitalism, yes, we can go into political economy of how those normalization happens and so forth. But I think in a way, it's focusing on how power works. To me, that enables us beyond, for instance, class consciousness, the party-led sort of a vanguard. So we can, in a way, by seeing those micro level, political economy, I think that would open up the whole new dimension of how we can actually transcend this capitalist exploitation system. So that's the kind of angle I'm taking, but I know where you're coming from. And definitely we need a political economy analysis. What Polanyi would say about this, that's totally, I think I agree with you. That's really important. But I'm sort of taking a different approach. To be honest with you, I'm coming from like the Felix Guattari and Gilles Deleuze, the capitalism and schizophrenia. So that's, to me, was like, my graduate student days, I kind of assimilate that into myself. So my focus tends to be in those molecular shape of power, but definitely the capitalism is in the background. So it's not forgotten, I want to assure you.
So we have a few additional questions, but I wanted to kind of gauge the temperature as it is getting late, and whether those questions can be answered later in a follow-up email to our guests and invitees. How are you guys in taking a few more questions, or shall we draw this to a conclusion? Mark got the thumbs up from Masa.
Sure, it's okay with me. I mean, I don't know about the all of our guests, but
Yeah.
I'm willing to hang on, sure.
So let's see, how might people speak out about things that shaped the tragic actions of these young men. I'm not. I'm wondering if
that-
that's in relation to. Go ahead,
Kyle
Karina.
Rittenhouse and
Oh, Kyle
Elliot
Rittenhouse.
Rogers. So that was just
Yeah.
a secondary question.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So then this question is for Masa. I like the idea of carnivalesque in terms of enjoying activism and using new methods, but where do you find your moral compass at the carnival?
That's a good one. Yeah, that's a really good one. I would say the moral compass is where cannibalists can work to disrupt, deconstruct, and perhaps eliminate any type of rigid ideological process. So it's almost like a celebratory deconstruction. So all those like party lines or even like the MAGA movement, that becomes a sort of like a memes. And by turning that to memes, in a way, you enjoy the process and you are deconstructing it. And in a way, you actually moving beyond that. I think there's more compasses in this. In a way, when we talk about ethics and moral compasses, we tend to be kind of stiff and, we have to behave this way, that. But the whole freedom of play and, enjoyment and celebration, like the sexuality and all that, I think that's a really strong political weapon against the, Nazism, the remnants of Nazism, anti-Semitism, and all those ideologies that really create this rigid structure from the molecular level. So it's a sort of liberation part. I think it's the moral compasses. But that's a good question. I have to think about it.
I think this question, and it looks like the last one for tonight, it was from Professor Herman, asking about the threat of racism and proto-fascism running through America's history, culminating in neo-fascism of the present. And just wanted to hear more about that. And I know you both touched a little bit about that, but was there anything else you wanted to add?
Yeah, thank you, Alfie. If I could just add the connection between the eugenics movements of Nazi Germany and the United States, because as I mentioned, the Nazis were really they weren't an isolated case, but they really were the tip of a much larger iceberg, the masses of which laid beneath the visibility under the ocean. And the United States had an incredibly large eugenics program in effect during the 1930s and for decades beyond. And the 2 points I would put out is that the victims of compulsory sterilization programs, there were and as of 1932, there were 26 states that had laws that made it legal for the state to forcibly sterilize people. And there was one analysis of, for example, in North Carolina that found 65% of the people who were sterilized were African American. There was a massive sterilization program in Puerto Rico that was carried out under, which was what was and still is a U.S. territory, carried out under pressure from the United States. And there was massive sterilization of Native American people as well, disproportionate to their population. And the other thing I would say, the second point, was that it was invariably targeted towards women, that women in the in Nazi Germany as well were far more likely to be subjects of forced sterilization than men. So it's a gendered, but we have to take a gendered approach to the understanding of eugenics as well. And not only negative eugenics, preventing people from reproducing, but also quote unquote positive eugenics as defined by scholars, meaning not that it's good, but encouraging those deemed racially valuable to have greater biological reproduction. Those state efforts also invariably were more targeted at women.
Masa, did you want to add anything?
That's well stated. I was just thinking about like, just when I was listening to Alan, just came up to me like, to me, like there are those things that very similar. right? So like the neo-fascism, it's kind of similar to the fascism, how fascism was, the anti-Semitism happening. But I tend to pay attention to something really new, but that's kind of similar. So what I thought about when you were talking, Alan, I was thinking about the disappearance of Native women. So that's sort of the process of this genocide that's happened in a subtle way. And there's a major contrast when, if you remember, Gabby Petito disappeared, and the whole media and the security forces mobilized, but Native women are disappearing every day. And we're not paying attention to it, but that's what's happening. And it's sort of like a new form of this neo-fascism happening on the American continent. So to me, I have to be sort of attentive to those new forms. That's kind of work out, Alan, right? So he, coming historian, I'm more like attentive to new forms. So we have to have this two perspective to determine what's happening currently, so we can change the situation, transform the situation for us to survive as a human species in an age of climate change.
There's a great book called Pure America, Eugenics and the Making of Modern Virginia, kind of talking about the eugenics movement from 1927 to like the 70s. So I wouldn't be a librarian if I didn't recommend some books for you folks, but it was a good title. It looks like Alan's holding up a.
There's one too, the Hour of Eugenics. It's a bit old, but it's transnational in scope. Definitely recommend it.
Without, I think that's a good place to stop. Thank you so much again to Dr. Alan Rosenfeld and Dr. Masahide Kato for your excellent presentations and giving us so much of your time today. We really appreciate it, and we thank our audience for attending and giving lending your ears and time for this event. We really appreciate it.